G'day everyone, and a massive welcome back to our channel, where we share the most moving and transformative stories from extraordinary individuals right here in Australia. I'm Eduardo, and today, I've got a story that's going to profoundly touch your hearts, a tale of courage, forgiveness, and how it's possible to transmute life's most harrowing experiences into purpose and healing. Before we dive in, I want you all to know that this is a true story, recounted with all the respect and tenderness it so rightly deserves. If you, or anyone you know, has navigated similar circumstances, please remember that there is always hope, always a path to healing, and it's never too late to pen a new chapter in your life. Have you ever stopped to consider the sheer volume of secrets we carry throughout our lives? How many experiences do we hold in silent confinement, believing we can never truly share them? Today's story centers on someone who bore an immense burden for over 7 decades, until she finally mustered the fortitude to transform her pain into illumination for others. Our protagonist is Eleanor Thompson, an 85-year-old matriarch residing in Perth, Western Australia. For more than 70 years, Eleanor harbored a narrative that shaped her entire existence, yet one she had never fully disclosed to anyone. Until, one day in 2024, she made a decision that would alter not only her own trajectory but that of hundreds of others. Eleanor had always been recognized within her neighborhood as the kindest lady on the street. Neighbors would describe her as someone perpetually beaming with a smile, always ready to lend a hand, and invariably possessing words of encouragement for anyone in need. What no one could possibly have surmised was that behind that warm demeanor and genuine benevolence lay a story of survival and triumph that would define the very essence of human resilience. Perth, where Eleanor has lived for over 60 years, is a city renowned for its breathtaking coastlines and welcoming communities. However, back in 1952, when Eleanor arrived at the tender age of 13 with her family, the city presented a markedly different tableau. It was an era when children possessed considerably less legal protection, when rural families grappled with extreme economic hardships, and when certain practices we now deem utterly unacceptable were, regrettably, more prevalent. Eleanor's family had migrated from the Western Australian hinterland to Perth in pursuit of enhanced opportunities. Her father, William, worked as a farm labourer, and his mother, Rose, looked after the house and 6 children. Eleanor was the second eldest, a responsible girl who from a young age helped care for her younger siblings. Life was not easy for the Thompson family. William worked long hours for meagre wages, and Rose took on sewing work at home to supplement the family's income. They lived in a small house in the suburbs of Perth, in an era before the social welfare programs we have today existed. It was within this context of financial hardship that, in 1953, when Eleanor turned 12, her life took a turn she could never have imagined. A proposal arrived for the Thompson family, a proposal that, at the time, was presented as an opportunity and a solution to the family's financial woes, but which in reality represented something far more complex and disturbing. As was common in rural communities and struggling families back then, the practice of arranged marriage existed, not solely for cultural reasons, but also out of economic necessity. A more affluent family had expressed interest in Eleanor marrying their eldest son, Robert Patterson, a 34-year-old man who had inherited a prosperous farm but had never managed to find a wife. For Eleanor's parents, this proposal represented several things. Firstly, it would ensure Eleanor had financial security for the remainder of her life. Secondly, it would reduce the number of mouths to feed at home, allowing resources to be directed towards their other children. Thirdly, it would be considered an honor within the community. After all, the Pattersons were one of the most respected and prosperous families in the region. But for Eleanor, a girl of merely 12 years who still played with dolls and dreamt of becoming a teacher, this proposal represented the end of her childhood and the beginning of a life for which she was neither physically nor emotionally prepared. I want you to understand the historical context here. We are talking about 1953, a very different time from our own. Child protection laws were limited, women's rights were restricted, and decisions about marriage were frequently made by parents, especially in situations of economic hardship. What happened to Eleanor was not technically illegal at the time, but that does not mean it was right or that it did not cause profound trauma. Eleanor told me, during our long conversation last year. In retrospect, when her parents explained the arrangement to her, she initially didn't fully grasp its implications. "I thought it would be like playing house," she told me, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped a teacup. "I had no idea what was truly being decided about my life." The wedding preparations spanned 3 months. During this time, Eleanor was withdrawn from school, a decision that deeply saddened her, as she relished her studies. Her mother, along with other female relatives, commenced grooming her for wifely duties, imparting lessons in more intricate household chores and vaguely outlining the expectations placed upon her within the marital union. Robert Patterson frequented the Thompson household regularly throughout this period. Eleanor recalls him as a tall, stout man who spoke sparingly but consistently brought gifts, sweets for her, tools for her father, fabrics for her mother. "He wasn't ill-intentioned," Eleanor reflects today, "but he was an adult man with adult needs and expectations, while I was still a child." What troubled Eleanor most at the time wasn't merely the prospect of the marriage itself, but the profound sense that her own voice, her own desires, were rendered inconsequential in the decision-making process. When she attempted to articulate her fears or doubts, she was gently dissuaded by her parents, who impressed upon her that this was the best opportunity she would ever have in life and that she ought to be grateful for the security it would provide. It is important that you understand I am sharing this narrative not to cast judgment upon the individuals involved, but to honor Eleanor's journey of healing and to offer hope to anyone who has navigated periods of vulnerability in their childhood. Eleanor's parents were not malevolent individuals. They were desperate people striving to do what they believed was best for their daughter in an era marked by limited resources and restricted choices. Nor was Robert Patterson a predator in the criminal sense. He was a product of his time, someone who viewed such arrangements as a commonplace and acceptable transaction. However, this does not diminish the impact that this situation had on Eleanor's life, nor the validity of her feelings and trauma. The wedding took place in March 1954, a modest affair at the local church. Eleanor remembers wearing a white dress that was several sizes too large, borrowed from an older cousin. She recalls herself feeling like she was watching someone else's life, as if none of it was really. Eleanor chose her words carefully. "He'd buy me pretty dresses, give me gifts, show me off to the neighbors as if I was some acquisition he was proud of. But he never asked what I wanted, what I felt, or what I was afraid of." The age difference created a dynamic where Eleanor constantly felt like a child attempting to play the role of an adult. Robert would discuss farm business, local politics, and future plans, while Eleanor was still grappling with basic concepts of household management and marital responsibilities that were entirely alien to a girl her age. The most challenging aspect of Eleanor's new life was the isolation. The farm was remote, with the nearest neighboring property several kilometers away. There were no other children or young people around. The only people Eleanor interacted with regularly were Robert and the occasional farmhands, adult men with whom she had little in common. Eleanor told me she developed several coping strategies for this solitude. She began writing in a journal, initially just a few sentences about her day, but eventually expanding to pages of thoughts, fears, dreams, and reflections. "Writing became my way of keeping my sanity," she explained. "It was the only place where I could be completely honest about how I was feeling." She also found solace in the farm animals. There were chickens, pigs, a few cows, and a sheepdog named Rex who became her closest companion. "Rex was the only one who seemed to truly listen to me," Eleanor smiles, recalling. "I'd talk to him for hours, telling him all my fears and confusions." During the early years of her marriage, Eleanor also faced expectations that were entirely inappropriate for her age. There was constant pressure, not just from Robert, but also from older members of the Patterson family, for her to behave like a proper wife, which included expectations around physical intimacy and eventually having children. This is one aspect of Eleanor's story that is particularly difficult to address, yet crucial to understanding her healing journey. Eleanor was thrust into situations for which she was neither physically nor emotionally prepared. While Robert was never physically violent, The reality was that Eleanor was a child being treated as an adult in all respects, including the most intimate of marriage. I didn't understand what was happening to me, Eleanor confided, her words imbued with the weight of decades of processed grief. No one had properly explained what it meant to be a wife. I just knew it was expected of me, and I'd always been a people pleaser, wanting to do the right thing. Over our 2 years of conversation, yes, it took Eleanor 2 years to feel comfortable enough to fully share her story, she detailed how she developed psychological survival mechanisms. She learned to mentally check out during difficult situations, imagining herself elsewhere, often back in her childhood home, playing with her siblings. At 15, Eleanor became pregnant for the first time. The pregnancy was both physically and emotionally taxing. Her body was still developing, and she lacked adequate emotional support to navigate the changes she was experiencing. She gave birth to a daughter, Margaret, in 1957. Motherhood introduced entirely new dimensions to Eleanor's experience. On one hand, she finally had someone to love unconditionally, someone who depended entirely on her. On the other hand, she was raising a child while still, in many respects, a child herself. When Margaret was born, Eleanor told me, I remember looking at her and thinking, how can I care for you when I still need to be cared for myself? But at the same time, she gave me a purpose I'd never had before. Eleanor threw herself into motherhood. She devoured every child-rearing book she could find, penned constant letters to her own mother for advice, and gradually built confidence in at least one facet of her new adult life. 2 years later, she had a second child, David. By 17, Eleanor was the mother of 2 young children, the wife of a man 16 years her senior, and was still trying to figure out who she truly was as a person. It was during this period that Eleanor began to cultivate what she calls her quiet strength. She realized that while she had no control over many of her life circumstances, she had absolute control over how she cared for her children and the values she imparted to them. I made a conscious decision, Eleanor explained, that no matter what I had missed out on from my own childhood, I would ensure Margaret and David had the best childhood possible. They would have had choices that I didn't. They would have known they were loved unconditionally. Eleanor began to homeschool Margaret and David, as the nearest school was too far away. She rediscovered her passion for learning through teaching her children. She asked Robert to buy books, educational materials, and even an old piano so the children could learn music. Slowly, Eleanor also began to find her voice on the farm. She suggested improvements in household management, started a vegetable garden that eventually became a significant source of income, and gradually took on more responsibility in running the farm. Robert, who had initially seen Eleanor primarily as a decorative wife, began to recognize her practical contributions. She's got a head for figures, he would tell neighbors. And the children have never been better looked after. But even as Eleanor built this new identity as a capable mother and a contributing partner on the farm, she carried a deep sadness for the childhood she had lost and the choices she had never had the opportunity to make. During the lonely evenings, Robert often worked late or traveled to sell cattle, Eleanor continued to write in her diary. Her entries grew more sophisticated and introspective over the years. She began to analyze her feelings, to question the circumstances that had brought her there, and slowly, to imagine what kind of life she would like to build for herself and her children. I started to realize, Eleanor told me, that I wasn't just a victim of circumstances. I had some choices, even if they were small ones. And each small choice I made to improve our situation gave me a little more strength. By her 20s, Eleanor had transformed from a scared and confused girl into a determined and capable young mother. She still carried deep trauma from her early experiences, but she was beginning to build an identity of her own based on her own decisions and values. But Eleanor's journey was far from over. The years ahead would bring challenges that would test all the strengths she had built, but also opportunities for her to finally begin healing the deepest wounds of her soul. If you are identifying with Eleanor's journey, I want you to remember that healing is always possible, no matter how much time has passed or how deep the wounds are. Eleanor shows us that it is possible to find strength even in the most trying circumstances. Stay with me, because the most transformative part of Eleanor's story is yet to come. The 1960s heralded significant shifts not only for Australia as a nation, but specifically for Eleanor's life on the Patterson farm. She was now in her early 20s, and while still remarkably young, she had cultivated a maturity forged by experiences few her age had ever encountered. Margaret, her eldest daughter, was now 6 and exhibited a vibrant intellect that filled Eleanor with both pride and resolve. David, aged 4, was an inquisitive and energetic boy who ceaselessly probed the world around him with questions. Witnessing her children flourish, healthy and content, imbued Eleanor with a sense of purpose she'd never before fathomed. When I saw Margaret reading her first book all by herself, Eleanor recounted to me, her eyes alight, I knew that no matter what I had lost, I was building something beautiful. She had choices I never did, and that made every difficult day worthwhile. During this epoch, Eleanor began to gradually broaden her horizons beyond the confines of the farm. Robert, acknowledging her administrative prowess and innate sagacity, started taking her along to town meetings concerning farm business on occasion. Initially reticent in these discussions, Eleanor gradually began to interject with suggestions and observations that garnered the admiration of other local farmers and merchants. It was on one of these excursions to town that Eleanor encountered an individual who would irrevocably alter her self-perception. At the Perth Municipal Library, whilst perusing educational volumes for the children, she met Sarah Mitchell, a middle-aged librarian who also happened to be an organizer for an informal support network for young women. Sarah noticed Eleanor immediately, a young mother who appeared older than her years yet perused books with an uncommon intensity and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. "You seem like someone with stories to tell," Sarah remarked gently, assisting Eleanor in selecting educational materials. This casual observation unlocked a portal that had been sealed for years. Eleanor, who had hitherto confined her sentiments and experiences solely to her journal, found herself spontaneously conversing with an empathetic stranger about her challenges as a young mother on an isolated farm. Sarah asked no intrusive questions but offered something Eleanor had been starved of for years: genuine validation of her experiences and feelings. "Being a young mother is hard," Sarah stated simply, "especially when you feel like you've lost parts of yourself along the way. But it's never too late to rediscover who you are." Sarah invited Eleanor to join the monthly gatherings of a women's group that met at the library to discuss books, share experiences, and support each other through life's challenges. Eleanor was initially hesitant. She'd never done anything like it before, and wasn't sure Robert would approve. But when she mentioned the group to Robert, his reaction was surprisingly positive. "You've been very isolated," he observed. "A bit of female company might do you good, and consequently do us all good." The group's first meeting was transformative for Eleanor. For the first time since leaving her family at 12, she found herself in a room full of women of varying ages, all sharing stories, challenges, and mutual support. There were widows, single mothers, divorced women, and women who, like Eleanor, had married very young. "I remember sitting in that circle," Eleanor reflected, "and realizing that I wasn't alone. Other women had faced difficult circumstances and found ways to build meaningful lives for themselves." One of the women in the group, Patricia Walsh, had married at 15 and was now, at 30, studying to become a teacher through correspondence courses. Another, Helen Cooper, had started a small dressmaking business after her husband died, leaving her with 3 young children to support. Eleanor didn't immediately share every detail of her own story, but she began to absorb the strength and wisdom of the other women. She learned about educational resources she hadn't known existed, work opportunities that could be done from home, and most importantly, she began to understand that her life didn't have to be defined solely by the circumstances of how it had begun. Inspired by the group, Eleanor began to make gradual but significant changes in her own life. She enrolled in a correspondence course to complete her secondary education, something that had been interrupted when she married. She studied in the early morning hours, before the children woke, and at night after they had gone to sleep. Robert initially didn't understand why she wanted to study. "You have all you need right here," he said. But Eleanor, for the first time, found the courage to articulate her own desires. I want to be a good example for Margaret and David. I want them to know it's never too late to learn and grow. Eleanor also began contributing more actively to the farm's financial management. She discovered she possessed a natural aptitude for numbers and financial planning. Gradually, she took on responsibility for the farm's bookkeeping, negotiations with suppliers, and even some decisions regarding equipment investments. It was the first time I felt truly valued as a person, Eleanor explained to me. Not just as a wife and mother, but as an individual with my own skills and contributions. In 1968, when Eleanor was 27, she made a decision that marked a significant milestone in her journey of self-discovery. She applied to become a regional representative for a government program supporting rural families. The work would involve visiting other farms in the region, assisting families in accessing educational resources and social services. The decision generated some tension at home. Robert was concerned about how she would manage balancing work responsibilities with caring for the children and the household. However, Eleanor had carefully considered the logistics. The children were now old enough to attend school in town, they would relocate to a house in Perth during the week, and the job would allow her to leverage her personal experiences to help other women in similar situations. Securing this position was a pivotal moment in Eleanor's life. For the first time, she had a professional identity of her own income, and more importantly, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her immediate family. During her first few months on the job, Eleanor visited dozens of rural properties and met hundreds of women under varied circumstances. Many had married young, many faced isolation and challenges similar to those she had experienced. Some had endured even more arduous situations. It was through helping other women, Eleanor told me, that I truly began to process my own experiences. As I listened to their stories and offered support and resources, I was also, without realizing it, starting to heal parts of myself. Eleanor found she had a natural talent for listening without judgment, for offering practical advice, and for connecting people with resources that could improve their lives. Her supervisor frequently commented on her exceptional ability to gain the trust of women who were typically reluctant to accept external assistance. By the age of 30, Eleanor had undergone a complete transformation. She was no longer the timid girl who had arrived at the Patterson farm 17 years prior. She was a confident, capable woman, the compassionate individual who had found ways to transform her own difficult experiences into strength to help others. But even with all this personal and professional growth, Eleanor still carried deep wounds from her disrupted childhood. There were aspects of her story that she had never fully shared with anyone, not even with the women in her support group. These secrets continued to weigh on her, especially as her own children approached the age she was when her life had changed drastically. It was as if Eleanor had built a successful and meaningful life on a foundation that still had deep cracks. She had learned to function, to even thrive, but there were parts of her experience that remained unresolved, unaddressed, and unhealed. When Margaret turned 12, the same age Eleanor was when she got married, Eleanor was hit with a wave of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Seeing her daughter still so clearly a child, Eleanor was struck by the full reality of what had happened to her at that same age. "That's when I truly understood," Eleanor told me, tears welling in her eyes, "how small and helpless I was when my life changed forever." Margaret at 12 was still playing with dolls and worrying about homework. I was becoming a wife and eventually a mother. This realization marked the beginning of a new phase in Eleanor's journey, a phase where she would finally begin to confront and fully process the deepest traumas of her experience, and eventually find healing and peace. Stay with me, because the most transformative part of Eleanor's story is yet to come. The early 1970s ushered in a quiet revolution in Eleanor Thompson's life. At 31, she had established herself as a respected professional in her community, a devoted mother, and a contributing wife. But internally, she was weathering an emotional storm that had begun when her daughter Margaret turned 12. Seeing Margaret at that age, still so innocent, still so clearly a child, forced Eleanor to confront a reality she had, out of necessity, suppressed for nearly 2 decades. She began experiencing what she later learned were flashbacks, moments where she was transported back to her own 12-year-old self and relived the confusion, fear, and sense of powerlessness she had felt at the time. "I started having nightmares," Eleanor confided in me, during one of our most intimate conversations. "Dreams where I was simultaneously the adult woman I had become and the frightened child I was forced to leave behind. I'd wake up feeling like I was being pulled in two different directions." Eleanor knew she needed help, but in 1971, mental health resources were limited, especially in rural Australia. The concept of trauma therapy barely existed, and there was significant stigma attached to seeking psychological help. Most challenging of all, Eleanor had never told anyone, not even Robert, the full details of how young she had been when she married and the full extent of what that had meant for her. It was Sarah Mitchell, the librarian who had become a great friend, who first suggested Eleanor might benefit from talking with someone trained to help people process difficult life experiences. Sarah had noticed Eleanor seemed more troubled lately, more distant during their women's group meetings. Sarah never pushed or insisted, Eleanor recalled gratefully. She just mentioned there was a doctor in Perth who specialized in helping people work through difficult past experiences. She said sometimes talking to someone outside our immediate circle could bring a perspective we couldn't find on our own. After months of internal struggle, Eleanor finally made an appointment with Dr. James Crawford, one of the few psychologists in Perth who had experience working with what was then called adjustment disorders. The decision to seek help was terrifying for Eleanor. She had spent nearly 20 years learning to be strong, independent, and self-reliant. Admitting she needed help felt akin to admitting weakness. Her first session with Dr. Crawford was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in Perth while the children were at school. Eleanor told Robert she had administrative meetings related to work. Not exactly a lie, she reasoned, as looking after her mental health would ultimately help her professional performance too. "I remember sitting in that waiting room," Eleanor recalled, "and feeling like I could bolt at any moment. I'd never told anyone the full story of my childhood and my marriage. I didn't even know where to begin." Dr. Crawford was a kind, 50-something man who had studied innovative approaches to help people process traumatic experiences. He didn't push Eleanor to share more than she was comfortable with, but rather helped her understand that her recent struggles were a natural response to repressed experiences that were finally demanding attention. "He explained to me," Eleanor said, "that the human mind has ways of protecting us from experiences that are too intense to process at the moment they happen. But eventually, when we are stronger and safer, these experiences resurface because our minds know we are finally ready to deal with them." Over several months, Eleanor gradually shared her story with Dr. Crawford. She spoke of being removed from school at 12 years old, of feeling she had no voice in the decision that would define her entire life, of the confusion and fear of being made to fulfill adult roles when she was still just a child. Most importantly, Dr. Crawford helped Eleanor understand that her feelings were valid, that her experiences had indeed been traumatic, and that the strength she had developed over the years was not despite what had happened, but because of how she had chosen to respond to it all. "For the first time in my life," Eleanor told me with tears in her eyes, "someone helped me understand that I wasn't broken or damaged. I was a survivor who had done extraordinary things with the life I was given." Dr. Crawford introduced Eleanor to concepts that are commonplace in therapy today, but were revolutionary at the time. He helped her understand the difference between surviving and thriving, between functioning and truly healing, between carrying trauma and transforming it into wisdom. One of the most powerful exercises Dr. Crawford conducted was writing letters to her 12-year-old self, letters to her parents, now deceased, letters to Robert, and letters to her children. These letters were not to be sent. They were meant to help Eleanor process emotions that had been locked away for decades. The letter to her 12-year-old self was particularly transformative. Eleanor wrote, "Dear little Eleanor, I want you to know that nothing that happened to you was your fault. You were a child who deserved to be protected, to be heard, to have choices. You were not responsible for your family's difficult circumstances, and you did not need to sacrifice your childhood to solve problems of adults. But I also want you to know that your sweetness, your resilience, and your capacity to love, those wonderful qualities that made you who you were, have survived it all. You've grown into someone who protects other children, who gives people choices, who creates safety for others. Your pain has been transformed into purpose." Writing that letter allowed Eleanor to finally grieve her lost childhood while celebrating the strength she had discovered. It marked the beginning of genuine healing, rather than just survival. Dr. Crawford also helped Eleanor prepare for a conversation she knew she would eventually need to have with Robert. After nearly 20 years of marriage, Eleanor had never fully explained to her husband just how young she actually was when they married, nor how unprepared she was for the responsibilities thrust upon her. The conversation with Robert was one of the most difficult of her life. She chose a quiet evening when the children were at friends' houses and carefully explained everything: her age, her lack of understanding, her years of feeling as if she were merely playing a role rather than living authentically. Robert's initial reaction was defensive. "This was normal back then," he'd said. "My parents arranged the marriage because they thought it would be good for both families. I always treated you well." But Eleanor, strengthened by months of therapy, was able to articulate something she had never said before. "I know you always looked after me and treated me with kindness. But I need you to understand that I was a child who wasn't ready for marriage or motherhood. I need you to understand that what felt normal and proper to you felt overwhelming and frightening to me." The conversation continued over several weeks. Robert gradually began to grasp that, regardless of what was considered acceptable at the time, Eleanor had experienced real trauma that had affected her for decades. More importantly, he started to understand that acknowledging this trauma didn't diminish what they had built together, but it did explain some of the struggles Eleanor had carried in silence for so many years. Robert wasn't a bad man, Eleanor always stresses when recounting this part of the story. He was a product of his time. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. But when he understood how his actions had impacted me, affected, became my greatest supporter on my healing journey. With Robert's support and Dr. Crawford's guidance, Eleanor began to make decisions about her life based on her own desires, rather than obligations or expectations. She decided to continue her studies, later earning a degree in social work through part-time courses. She expanded her work supporting rural families, specializing in helping women and children in vulnerable situations. Above all, Eleanor came to see her experiences not as something that had ruined her life, but as something that had given her unique insights and compassion she could use to help others. "I realized," Eleanor told me, "that every difficult experience I'd faced had taught me something valuable about human resilience, about the importance of having choices, about the power of being truly heard and understood. I could use all of that to ensure that other people, especially young people, would never feel as alone and powerless as I had felt." By her early 30s, Eleanor had transformed from a survivor into someone who was thriving, from someone healing to someone helping others to heal. But her most significant contribution to the world was yet to come. Stay with me, because the most inspiring part of Eleanor's journey is about to unfold. In 1978, at the age of 37, Eleanor Thompson made a decision that would change not only her own life but the lives of hundreds of others. She decided to formally establish an organization to protect children and support young women in vulnerable situations. The inspiration came from a case she encountered through her work with rural families. A 13-year-old girl named Lisa had been promised in marriage to a 40-year-old man as part of a deal to settle family debts. When Eleanor learned of the situation, she felt a familiar wave of recognition and determination. "When I saw Lisa," Eleanor told me, "it was like looking into a mirror of the past. She had the same expression I remember having at 12, confused, scared, but trying to be brave because everyone was telling her it was the right thing to do." Eleanor knew that laws had changed since her own experience. The minimum age for marriage had been raised, and there were more protections for children. But she also knew that there were loopholes, particularly in isolated communities where traditional practices persisted, and where economic desperation could drive families to make desperate decisions. Working with a lawyer friend in Perth, Eleanor managed to intervene in Lisa's situation, connecting the family with financial assistance programs and ensuring the girl remained in school. But the case made Eleanor realize that reactive interventions were insufficient. preventative education and support systems were needed to stop these situations from arising in the first place. Eleanor started small. She organized workshops in rural communities about children's rights, educational opportunities for young people, and the resources available to families facing economic hardship. Her own story, shared with care and at the opportune moment, became a powerful tool in helping parents understand the long-term impact of decisions made in times of crisis. I found, Eleanor reflected, that when I shared my experience, parents who might have been considering similar arrangements for their children began to see the situation differently. They could see the child, not just an immediate fix for their problems. Robert, who was initially skeptical of Eleanor's burgeoning activism, gradually became her greatest supporter. He saw how passionate I was about this work, Eleanor explained, and how I was also healing myself by helping others. He also realized that our own children were thriving because they had a fulfilled and purposeful mother. Margaret, now 16, and David, 14, were old enough to understand some aspects of their mother's story. Eleanor spoke with them in an age-appropriate manner about the importance of having choices, the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, and the value of education and independence. Margaret once told me, Eleanor recounted proudly, that seeing me turn my difficult experiences into something useful for others taught her that she too could overcome anything life threw her way. It was at that moment I realized all the hard work of healing had been worth it. In 1980, Eleanor formalized her work by establishing the Safe Futures organization, a support network for at-risk youth and families. The organization offered education on children's rights, financial guidance for families in crisis, scholarships for young women from rural areas, and services. Counseling for anyone who had experienced childhood trauma or forced marriages. What made Safe Futures unique was Eleanor's insistence that all services be provided with complete confidentiality and without judgment. I remembered how much shame I carried for so many years, she explained, and I wanted to ensure that anyone who came to us felt safe and supported, not judged or pitted. Eleanor also forged partnerships with schools, healthcare professionals, and government agencies to create a comprehensive support network. She trained teachers to recognize signs of at-risk children, worked with doctors to provide appropriate care for young mothers, and collaborated with social workers to ensure families had access to all available resources. By the mid-1980s, Safe Futures had assisted over 300 families and prevented dozens of child marriages through education, support, and intervention where necessary. Eleanor's work began to gain state-level attention, and she was invited to consult on policy changes concerning children's rights and marriage laws. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Eleanor's work was the ripple effect it generated. Many of the young women she helped became advocates themselves. Lisa, the 13-year-old girl whose situation inspired Eleanor to formalize her work, eventually became a social worker specializing in child protection. Eleanor saved my life, Lisa told me when I interviewed her last year. But more than that, she showed me that my experiences, even the most difficult ones, could become a source of strength to help others. She taught me that just surviving isn't enough. We need to flourish, and help others flourish too. Eleanor continued to lead Safe Futures for over 20 years, gradually training others to take on leadership roles as she aged. By 2005, when she officially retired from active management, the organization had assisted over 2,000 families and had offices in 3 Australian states. Even in retirement, Eleanor's mission was not complete. At 67, she began writing her memoirs, not just for publication, but as a resource for other survivors. She spent 3 years carefully crafting her story, working with editors and therapists to ensure the book would be helpful rather than triggering for readers with similar experiences. I wanted people to know, she explained, that healing is possible, that it's never too late to reclaim your strength and your voice, and that our most difficult experiences can become our greatest sources of compassion and resilience. Her book, titled From Child Bride to Advocate, A Journey of Healing and Hope was published in 2010 and became a bestseller in Australia. More importantly to Eleanor, The book generated thousands of letters from readers sharing their own stories and thanking her for giving them hope and direction in their healing journeys. Today, in 2024, Eleanor Thompson is 85 years old and lives in a comfortable home in Perth, surrounded by photos of the hundreds of people she has helped over the decades. Her daughter Margaret is now a child psychologist, inspired by her mother's work. Her son David is a teacher specializing in at-risk youth. Her legacy lives on not only through her children but also through the countless lives she has touched. When I reached out to her to share her story, Eleanor was hesitant. "I've told my story many times," she said, "but always in professional contexts or in my book. I wasn't sure about sharing it so personally." What convinced her was the explanation of the purpose of these videos: to offer hope and inspiration to people who might be facing difficult experiences. "If my story can help even one person understand that healing is possible," she said, "then it's worth sharing again." Over our many hours of conversation across 2 years, Eleanor shared insights that only come from decades of healing and helping others to heal. Here are some of the most important ones she wants everyone to understand. First, healing is not a destination, but a journey. "People always ask me when I finally got over what happened to me," Eleanor said. "The truth is, I didn't get over it. I grew through it. I integrated those experiences into who I am today, but in a way that serves me, not that limits me." Second, you are not defined by what happened to you, but by how you choose to respond to it. "For many years," she explained, "I felt I was just a victim of circumstance. But I realized that while I couldn't control what happened to me, I could control what I would do with those experiences." Third, healing requires both inner work and outward action. Therapy and self-reflection were crucial, she highlighted, but it was also essential to find ways to use my experiences to help others. When we transform our pain into purpose, we complete the healing cycle. Fourthly, it's never too late to reclaim your strength. Whether you're 25 or 75, Eleanor stated, you can start making choices based on what you desire, not what others expect. Age doesn't disqualify anyone from growing or changing. Fifthly, sharing your story, when you're ready and in safe environments, can be incredibly powerful. For decades, I kept my story hidden, except in therapy and with my closest family, she said. But when I finally began to share it more widely, I discovered that vulnerability can be a superpower. It connects us to others and helps break down the shame that keeps trauma alive. Eleanor also offers specific advice for those going through similar experiences. If you've endured childhood trauma or were forced into adult roles before your time, know that your feelings are valid, your experiences matter, and healing is entirely possible. You might need professional help, and there's no shame in that. You might need to have difficult conversations with people in your life. This takes courage, but it's worth it. The most important thing is to be patient with yourself as you heal. Her advice for family and friends of trauma survivors is equally important. Don't try to minimize or justify someone's trauma. Don't say things like it was normal back then, or at least it wasn't worse. Instead, listen without judgment, validate their feelings, and support their pursuit of professional help if needed. Sometimes, the most healing thing you can do is simply acknowledge that what happened wasn't right and that the person deserved better. For parents, Eleanor leaves this message. Your children are not solutions to your problems. No matter how difficult your circumstances, your children deserve to be children for as long as possible. They deserve to have choices about their own lives. If you're facing financial hardship, seek assistance from community organizations, government programs, or churches before making decisions that will affect your child's entire life. In the final session of our interview, I asked Eleanor what she would like, so that people would remember more about her story. Her response surprised me. "I don't want people to focus on the trauma," she said thoughtfully. "I want them to focus on the transformation. I want them to see that someone who started life with so little power and so few choices can end up creating an organization that helps thousands of people, can write a book that inspires healing, and can raise children who go on to help others. I want people to understand," she continued, that the beginning doesn't have to define the end. You have the power to write the subsequent chapters of your life, no matter how difficult the early ones were. Eleanor's story demonstrates something profound about human resilience. It shows us that it is possible not only to survive trauma but to flourish beyond it. It proves that our most painful experiences can become our greatest sources of wisdom and compassion. Today, Safe Futures continues to operate under new leadership, assisting families and protecting children across Australia. Eleanor's book remains popular, especially among survivors and mental health professionals. But perhaps her most significant legacy is the ripple effect of healing she initiated. Hundreds of people helped directly, who then went on to help others, creating waves of positive change that continue to spread. Sometimes people call me a hero, Eleanor reflected in our last conversation. But I don't see myself that way. I see myself as someone who refused to let difficult experiences have the final say in my life. I think anyone can do that, maybe not in the same way, but in their own way. Eleanor's final message to those listening today is simple, yet powerful. Your story isn't over. No matter what you've lived through, no matter how powerless you feel, no matter how much time has passed, your story isn't over. You are the one who decides what comes next. To everyone who has followed Eleanor's story today, I want to leave you with this thought. Look around your own community. There might be an Eleanor among you, someone who has turned pain into purpose, someone who is quietly making the world better because of what they've overcome. And perhaps, just perhaps, that person might be you. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, if it brought you hope or inspiration, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below, recounting what left the most indelible mark on her journey. And if you're grappling with difficult experiences, know that help is available and healing is within reach. Remember that Eleanor was 85 years old when she decided to share her complete story in this format for the very first time. It's never too late to find your voice, never too late to seek healing, and never too late to transform your experiences into something that can help others. Thank you for accompanying me on this incredible journey through Eleanor's life. Her courage in sharing her story is a gift to us all. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.